Hello, everyone. Welcome to the lecture series on pre-modern Japanese history. This is our first lecture of the series, and today, very simply, I'm just going to go over the different Japanese era names and then talk about some of the key features and a very basic general overview of each of those periods. So, let's get started. Okay, so first, what are the major Japanese eras? Well, they would be like this. First, we have the Paleolithic era, followed by Jomon era, Yayoi, the Tomb or Kofun period, Asuka or Yamato period, Nara, Heian, Kamakura, Muromachi, Azuchi Momoyama, Edo, Meiji, Taisho, Showa, Heisei, and now what we're in, Reiwa. And in this class, we're going to be talking about all of these all the way up until about halfway through the Edo era. And we'll just very generally categorize this as pre-modern history. And next semester, we'll be taking a look at modern Japanese history and picking up where we left off in this class midway through the Edo period up until the present. So next I want to just go into a little bit more detail, an overview of each one of these eras, and touch on some of their most important features. So first, starting with the Paleolithic period in Japan, in Japanese Kyuseki Jidai. So it's thought that humans were in Japan on the Japanese archipelago from as early as 35,000 BC, and they would have come over on land bridges that were connecting Korea with Kyushu, and the ocean levels were much lower at this time, so they probably could have just walked over. This is categorized as a pre-ceramic period, meaning that there are no remains or evidence that people at this time made any kind of clay pottery. And here we have just a general image of what a society might have looked like at that time. Then we go on to the Jomon period. And this started about 20,000 years ago when the last ice age ended and the earth started to warm, and there were massive changes all around the globe. Woolly mammoths, for instance, all kinds of animals, species started to die out. And Jomon refers to the rope pattern pottery, and this is an example of this Jomon era pottery that was one of the distinctive features of people in this period in Japan. So because they made this kind of rope style pottery, we just call this period the Jomon period, from about 12,000 to 5,000 BCE. And people at this time were mainly hunters and gatherers. And we can tell what generally life was like for them at that time, of course, through archaeological digs at their sites, digging up remains of houses, and determining what village life was like, and also looking at shell middens, which or in Japanese are called kaizuka. And basically these were garbage dumps. So archaeologists today will go through garbage dumps of Jomon villages and look at what people left behind and determine what they ate, and then this tells us a lot about people's lifestyles. So still at this time people were generally hunters and gatherers, but they lived in semi-permanent villages, very small villages of just between 6 to 10 households, right? And the population throughout Japan at this time would have been roughly maybe 125,000 to 250,000 people. And Jomon people would have been speaking a language that was related to Chinese, Korean, or Altaic languages such as Mongolian or Turkish. And these are just some general images of Jomon style dwelling, like this. Part of this would have been dug under the ground, so it's dug halfway under the ground with a fire in the middle and a place for smoke from the fire to rise out through the roof. And then this is what a village would have looked like. You can see again, very small, just 5 about households in this image, and centered around hiroba, common public gathering space. And this would have been the center of daily life. And we can tell from this that Jomon community and society was very community-oriented and a rather vertically horizontally arranged society, meaning that it was not so hierarchical at that time. It was fairly equal society. And here we can see also these places where people would have dumped their garbage. And these are what we dig up today to determine what people were eating at that time. So the next era that we will look at is the Yayoi era, Yayoi Jidai. And during this time, one of the major events that was happening is that massive waves of immigrants were coming over from the Asian continent, Asian mainland, through China and Korea, especially. And they were carrying with them all kinds of new technology and language and religion and many different kinds of things. 2 of the most important technological advancements in this period were, 1, the use of different metals. So previously people would have just been making things out of clay pottery. Now we start to see simple metalwork using bronze and iron, and people making mirrors, swords, spears, bells called do-taku, and other things of the like. And then the second important advancement was rice cultivation was carried over from Korea. And rice cultivation brought with it many different kinds of massive changes to society. Rice cultivation requires many more people to undertake than simple farming or hunting and gathering. So a lot more people are necessary to cultivate rice, and it requires a lot of land use as well as it requires people to then settle down basically permanently in one area. And rice cultivation and these other technological advancements also created the beginnings of simple class divisions in society. And society becomes more hierarchical. You have the emergence of chiefs and chiefdoms, people who would own most of the land probably, and then other people would work for them, and society would be centered around them. And then this is where we have some of also the earliest written records of Japan. They come from China, and at this time, in a kingdom, the kingdom Yamataikoku, and the perhaps mythical or not much is known about her princess, Himiko, who sent an envoy to China in 238 CE. And we'll read a little bit more about her, or talk a little bit more about her later. Excuse me. This is just an image from a high school history textbook of what Yayoi a village might look like in simple rice cultivation. You can see that village sizes are now much bigger. There are many more people involved in this process of rice planting and cultivation. And then this is an image of Yoshinogari, a village that has been archaeologically excavated and now reconstructed in Saga Prefecture. And you can see different styles of dwellings here, constructed on stilts. Some are very big, others are very small. You have guard posts here, as well as a defensive fence going, and a moat going all the way around the village. And at Yoshinogari, they have excavated remains of killed or slain soldiers along with weapons. So what this also tells us is that different clans or chiefdoms at this time had begun to fight against each other, partly as a result of the different hierarchical structure taking place in society and fighting over land and resources and other things. So one of the first kingdoms was a kingdom called Yamatai-koku. And there were 30 small kuni in Yayoi, but this was the largest. And in fact, the actual location of Yamatai-koku is not known exactly. It could have been somewhere in Kyushu, perhaps in the Kinnai region. It's not clear where that was. But there are records Chinese records, the history of the Wei dynasty, written in 297 CE, which talks about the land of the Wa people and Yamatai-koku, and a kingdom consisting of about 70,000 households. So this is quite large in size. From this time, there's evidence that hereditary kings had become more common. And then they start to try to solidify their power by creating myths that go back and justify their history and where they came from. So we see the development of oral myths and burial practices. This is evidenced, as we'll see later, in the construction of kofun, which are these giant burial mounds. And these things are all done to prove and legitimatize the hereditary rule of kings which emerge at this time. So I want to go in and talk about a little bit about now the Chinese histories. And there's, again, the periods that we've been talking about so far, there's no written records from Japan or from any of the Yamato rulers at this time yet. So we have to look instead at Chinese histories, which describe what Japan was perhaps generally like, at least seen through their eyes at this time. So one of them is from history of the Wei kingdom, or Wei dynasty. And now these are going in chronological order as well, and I've just pulled some quotes out from these different Chinese histories here. And we can see a little bit, we get an image at least of how early Japanese society was developing and changing at this time. So the history of the Wei dynasty reads, "The country formerly had a man as ruler. For some 70 or 80 years after that, there were disturbances and warfare. Thereupon, the people agreed upon a woman for their ruler. Her name was Pimiko." This is Himiko, but sometimes in English, especially in older translations, it's rendered as Pimiko. "She occupied herself with magic and sorcery, bewitching the people." So this indicates she was some kind of also quasi-religious figure. Okay, going on then to the Hohan Shu. Now this is from 150 years later, in 445. And this says, "The Wa dwell on mountainous islands southeast of Han," referring to Korea. in the middle of the ocean, forming more than 100 communities. From the time of the overthrow of the Chaoshan, northern Korea, by Emperor Wu, nearly 30 of these communities have held intercourse with the Han, referring to Chinese court, by envoys or scribes. Each community has its king, whose office is hereditary. The king of Great Wa resides in the country of Yamatai. So here's reference to Yamatai Koku. Okay, looking at the Suishu from 630 CE, both men and women paint marks on their arms and spots on their faces and have their bodies tattooed. They catch fish by diving into the water. They have no written characters, but understand only the use of notched sticks and knotted ropes. They revere Buddha and obtain Buddhist scriptures from Pakche. And Pakche is a kingdom in Korea that Japan had diplomatic relations with. Well, this clearly gives an image of what, I guess, Japanese people would have been, or may have looked like at this time, and quite different, obviously, than how we imagine people in Japan today, but bodies covered in tattoos, no written language, just use of notched sticks and knotted ropes. But then there are further changes, so going on to the Shin Tangshu, the new history of the Tang dynasty. The people are literate and revere the teachings of Buddha. So here it says they have no written characters, but going on to, in the new Tang history, it says that people are literate. So writing has been introduced sometime during this period to Japan, and most people have some knowledge of it. They revere the teachings of Buddha. Upon the enthronement of Jimmu, son of Hikonagi, the title was changed to Tenno, and the palace was moved to the province of Yamato. About this time, the Japanese who had studied Chinese came to dislike the name Wa and changed it to Nippon. And this is also written somewhere in the 7th century, so around this time, right? Now, looking at the Kofun era, from 300 to 552 BC, now these were built by powerful Japanese rulers all throughout the country, from Kyushu to northern Honshu. And there's about 10,000 of them, and they're called in English sometimes these keyhole-shaped tombs, because the shape obviously looks like kind of a keyhole. And these indicated the presence of very powerful political regimes. To give an indication of how powerful, the largest of these belonging to Emperor Nintoku near Osaka is one of the largest tombs in the world. And then through archaeological digs of these sites, they've found evidence of horse riding and other military goods. So a strong military structure, and the presence of tombs with all kinds of different religious figures and artifacts as well indicates, different religious beliefs and the belief in some kind of an afterlife, in addition to the clearly political roles that they played in demonstrating a ruler's hereditary power. Looking a bit more at the Yamato period, this was a flourishing of culture then in the Kinai and Asuka regions by Yamato chieftains. And there were different clans at this time, the main called Uji, and the main ones were the Soga, Monobe, and Nakatomi. In 593, the Soga clan places Empress Suiko on the throne, and she named Prince Shotoku as the regent, Shotoku Taishi, who we'll talk a bit more about in a minute. But during this time, there are many connections that Japan and the Yamato rulers maintained with China and Korea. For instance, the introduction of Chinese writing to Japan, which had occurred actually much earlier, earlier, but first was widely used during this period. And Yamato rulers also had diplomatic relations with the Korean kingdom of Pakche, as I mentioned. And this lasted from about 366 to 562 CE. In China at the time, the Sui dynasty began to unify China, and this was succeeded by the Tang dynasty. And this unification of China and a flourishing of culture there allowed for more of this culture to then find its way over to Japan. And among that, one of the most important developments from this time was the introduction of Buddhism to Japan in 583, again coming through China into Korea, and then being carried over through Japan's diplomatic relations with Korea. And this was promoted most by Prince Shotoku Taishi, who built one of the earliest Buddhist temples in Japan, Horyuji, and one of the oldest wooden structures in the world. And then he issued the 17-article Constitution, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail in a minute. And these things both work to promote Buddhist culture, Buddhist religion in Japan. Also during this period, the legal and political structure, or a legal and political structure was introduced that was modeled on the Chinese system of law. And this was called the Ritsudio, early development of the Ritsudio system. And it started with the Taika reforms. And Taika in Japanese, just the characters for it mean big change. So what was the big change in particular? Well, it was putting boundaries on all of the land and dividing up all the land, especially dividing it among powerful families and individuals, conducting a population survey, the introduction of taxes, legal and penal system of a system of laws and punishments. And then also things were centralized, power was centralized around the emperor, and the emperor then selected officials, government officials, who worked as bureaucrats basically to run the new political administration. The Constitution of Prince Shotoku, we'll read this in a later class, but just to look at some of the key points and to summarize them. Of course, the first one is probably the most well-known, but there was an emphasis on harmony, Chowa. There was also one about revering, the importance of revering Buddhist treasures, revering these 3 Buddhist treasures. So again, promotion of Buddhism. And then obeying the commands of the sovereign of heaven. Now, this is kind of like a sovereign ruler, comparing the sovereign to as heaven, basically. And there's strong overtones here of connections to the Chinese understanding of the role of the ruler and the ruled. There was one about the proper behavior of public officials, and then the subordination of private interests to the public good. But importantly, what the Constitution of Prince Shotoku did as well was to take power away from the various clan leaders who, up until this time, had been fighting amongst themselves, and to centralize power under the emperor. Okay, so then after this we have the Nara period. So a capital, one of the first capitals then is established at Nara, and it's modeled on the Chinese imperial capital at Chang'an, laid out on a grid. The population there expands greatly to about 200,000 people. Hereditary rule is still hereditary with different clans leaders, but they're serving as government officials now, under this centralized system of power. And we also see then the popularity of Buddhism skyrocket, and Buddhism itself becomes a political power. Part of the reason why Yamato rulers were so interested in implementing Buddhism in Japan was that it had this very centralized structure that was easy to work through in organizing the newly centralized state. This here is an image of Todaiji in Nara, and the giant Daibutsu would be sitting inside there. During the Nara period then, so the Empress Genmei commissioned the writing of the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, and these are what I will call just early mytho-histories. And they're basically designed, these are some of the first writings then in Japan, and they're basically designed to confirm the religious and political claims of the rulers, to legitimatize their origins by claiming that the political rulers, up until Empress Genmei herself, all descended from gods, from Amaterasu. And so they develop this complex mythology and then give an entire lineage of the, or supposed lineage anyway, of the imperial family, all the way up to the present emperor and empress. And this provides very strong then justification for their rule in the present. After the Nara period is the Heian era, roughly 200-year period of relative peace and political stability. The capital is moved to Heian-kyo, which is now known as Kyoto, where there's a flourishing of literature and arts. So much of what we think of now as kind of representative Japanese, quote, Japanese culture, writings such as Tale of Genji or the Pillow Book, for instance, these were works of art, early novels written by aristocrats and nobles. During this period, the introduction of kana alphabet, of hiragana, and writings in that style all developed during this time. Politically, the Fujiwara clan was the most powerful, and they ruled ostensibly as seisho, or regents to the emperor. So they're ruling in the emperor's stead, but in fact they maintained actual political control. The Heian period ends in a period of lawlessness and a rise of warrior clans, especially the Taira or Heike, and it should be Minamoto, not Miyamoto, sorry, and Genji clans. After that, the capital moves to Kamakura, and Minamoto no Yoritomo sets up a new government there called a tent government, or bakufu in Japanese, and he takes up the title of shogun. This is a title bestowed by the emperor, but it gives him basically complete political control of the country, and he starts to challenge the Ritsuryo system by setting up his own system of stewards to administer and collect state taxes, and they control lands. Eventually, though, the Hojo family, so his wife and her family, takes over and continues to rule until the end of the Kamakura era. Two important events which happened during this time were the Mongol invasions of 1268 and 1281. And eventually, this led to the collapse of the Kamakura Bakufu, because they at both times, the invading Mongol troops of Genghis and Kublai Khan were repelled in storms and freak accidents that drowned their ships, basically. But nevertheless, the Kamakura government spent massive amounts of money to pay troops to go to the shores of Kyushu to defend in case of an attack. And eventually, all of this expenditure on military buildup basically bankrupt the Kamakura government. After this, the capital is moved back to Kyoto, an area of Kyoto called the Muromachi area, and so this time period is then called the Muromachi period. The Ashikaga clan takes power after they overthrew the Hojo, but the Ashikaga clan were actually not so powerful, so some of the ways they held on to power were through just marrying into the royal family, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, establishing diplomatic connections and trade, for instance, with the Ming Dynasty in China. This period, in terms of arts and literature, which we'll talk more about later, is famous for, especially for instance, no gaku, for no theater, and also many other famous writings from this time. But this ended with the Onin War, Onin no Dan, in 1467 through 1477. The Ashikaga lose their hold on power, and the city of Kyoto is basically destroyed. Then there's a period of fighting, which all of this is also simultaneously known as Sengoku Jidai, but as well it's referred to as the Azuchi Momoyama period, and just again taking its title from place names. And the Ashikaga shogunate was being manipulated by Oda Nobunaga, who eventually starts to take control for himself and then begins this project of unifying the country. And so Oda Nobunaga is also known as one of the first three great unifiers who paved the way for the Tokugawa Bakufu to rule during the Edo period by unifying the country. And Oda Nobunaga is known as a very ruthless leader. He just completely wiped out his enemies, including the monks at Enryakuji on Hiezan Tendai monks there, and also the Jodo Shinshu sects. And both of these were Buddhist groups, religious figures, but they held a lot of power, a lot of influence in the court, and especially Jodo Shinshu, as a very populous sect, had attracted a lot of average persons as followers and held on to large estates and large tracts of land, and which were tax-free. So he builds Azuchi Castle near the shores of Lake Biwa, and eventually, though, he's assassinated by his general Akechi Mitsuhide, and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, one of his foot soldiers, carries on his project of unifying Japan, and then this is completed by Tokugawa Ieyasu, who's the third great unifier. And then begins the Tokugawa era after the Battle of Sekigahara, after Tokugawa Ieyasu was victorious there in 1600, and he sets up his new Bakufu government. So again, this word taken from the earlier Kamakura Bakufu, but this time in Tokyo, known as Edo. And his successors ruled as shogun for the next 250 years. The Tokugawa period is also known as a long period of relative peace and stability, and a flourishing of culture, literature, and the arts. Politically, the country was divided into 250 different Han. So this is known as the Bakuhan system, with a central Bakufu, central government in Tokyo, and then these 250 Han, which can be thought of as basically prefectures. And the Han are ruled by daimyo, who are forced to swear an allegiance to the Tokugawa government. But in order to maintain control over the daimyo, the Tokugawa Bakufu thought up many different ingenious methods. For instance, daimyo who had fought against the Tokugawa Bakufu, Tokugawa Ieyasu, at the Battle of Sekigahara, were given lands that were further away from the capital, so out toward Kyushu, for instance, and up in northern Japan. And those who had fought with him and were his allies or were members related to the Tokugawa family had better lands that were closer to the capital in Edo. And daimyo were also forced to spend a part of the year, half of the year, away from home in Edo. And this was called the Sankin Kotai system. So they had to maintain two separate residences. And this had the effects of allowing the Tokugawa Bakufu to, on the one hand, keep a close eye on the Bakufu, and on the other hand, it required a lot of money to maintain these elaborate residences and to conduct yearly trips all the way to the capital. So this prevented daimyo from getting too much power and building up too much wealth. Okay, so that is the end of today's lecture. And it was just a broad overview of the different Japanese eras that we're going to talk about this semester in this class. In later classes, we'll go into much more detail about each one of these eras, looking at different primary sources, government sources, works of literature, works of art, working with English and Japanese translations. But today, this was just a general introduction, and I hope you found it somewhat helpful and enlightening, and I look forward to our future lectures together.